Hi, you guys. Welcome back to another edition of History Tea with Professor T. I am Professor T, and that T stands for Professor Tracy Daniel. And in this edition, we will be learning about Chapter 21 in your text, which covers the New Deal. So, this chapter will have a scope of about 1932 to about 1940. I may dip in and out of these years just a bit to provide some context, but the scope of this chapter is about 8 to 10 years and is all about the New Deal. So I won't really I won't hold you with any housekeeping this time. We will jump right in. So the New Deal. First, what is the New Deal? The New Deal was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's plan for economic recovery for the United States. Beginning in about 1929, after the stock market crash, which remember did not cause the Great Depression by itself. There were many things that will cause the Great Depression. But after the stock market crashes, if you recall, many banks fail. There is no FDIC before the Great Depression. There is no FDIC. So if you had your money in a bank that failed, there was no coverage for you as a depositor. So if the bank failed, you simply lost your money in that bank. After the Great Depression, or as we recover from the Great Depression with the New Deal, we'll get a series of government-sponsored works programs and a lot of government-sponsored other types of programs that will help to spur economic recovery in the United States. I really like learning about the New Deal because you see a tide really turn as far as government responsibility. Prior to the New Deal, prior really to FDR, and maybe even Theodore Roosevelt, which is kind of his predecessor, but really it's FDR who will bring a lot of this out. Prior to that, a lot of politicians did not believe that it was the government's responsibility to help the people. So at the really the height, or when the Great Depression starts in 1929, Herbert Hoover is the president, and he doesn't really do anything to help the American people. And his name really kind of becomes mud to a lot of people. So much so that the shanty towns that people live in will become known as Hoovervilles, or a pocket turned inside out to show that you have no money in your pockets. That will be known as a Hoover flag. So Hoover doesn't really do anything to spur economic recovery. Instead, he puts a lot of his faith into voluntarism, which ends up failing. And by 1931-32, he has to admit that voluntarism has failed. Voluntarism is essentially going to businesses and corporations and asking them to voluntarily raise wages and hire more people. And of course, that doesn't go anywhere. And so by the time we get to FDR, who comes into office in 1932, his program of economic development called the New Deal is really going to help to spur the American economy by getting Americans to work. So, in this chapter, it's really going to be a bit of an alphabet soup of government programs. So, I hope that you are able to bear with me. I will explain each of these programs, and I'll also explain how the New Deal impacts African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans. So we'll get started now. So in this chapter, you really start to see a different definition of American freedom. American freedom starts to really take on this definition of being economic security and economic stability. Also, the government will take on, as I said before, a much larger role. The government will take on this role of actually helping people. So even though Herbert Hoover, I hate to say, or I really don't like to hear people say that he was a bad president, because really he didn't do anything that was so unusual for presidents of his day. At this time, I don't know if any other president would have really tried to help people to get out of the Great Depression. But it's during this New Deal era that the government will take on a much larger role. So while there are tons and tons of New Deal programs, a lot of these programs will be racially discriminatory, and we'll discuss that as we get a little later in the chapter. So prior to FDR actually entering office, the Conference on Home Building and Home Ownership was convened by President Herbert Hoover in 1931, where he says that homeownership is a birthright of American citizenship. However, the Great Depression devastated the American housing industry. Millions of Americans will either get kicked out of their homes and foreclosed on, or live in overcrowded, unhealthy urban living tenements, or in these ramshackle rural dwellings. And so it's at this conference that the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration will be created. The FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, will insure millions of long term mortgages issued by private banks. However, the FHA will prove to be problematic, and we'll talk about the FHA much more, especially if we are when we get to the 1950s, because the FHA, this organization, this program will really feature very intensely in the 1950s. But it's important to note now in 1931-32 that the FHA did not grant mortgages to Black families. So this is one of those New Deal era programs that is discriminatory. If you are a Black family, you're not able to get a mortgage, whereas white families are able to get a mortgage. So let's go into the first New Deal and let's learn a little bit about FDR. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born in 1882, and a little known fact. I often ask my students in person, what was Eleanor Roosevelt's maiden name? What was her name prior to her marrying Franklin Roosevelt? And the answer is her name was Roosevelt. They were actually cousins. FDR was a fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was Eleanor Roosevelt's uncle. So her brother, her father, he was her father's brother, right? Um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt will serve as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And in 1921, as an adult, he will contract polio. And when he contracts polio, he loses the use of his legs. So it's really Eleanor Roosevelt who will encourage him to continue to, one, be in politics, but to show up as healthy looking as possible. FDR's, I would say, his inability to walk was kind of like a well kept secret, even though a lot of people knew that he had polio. Whenever you see him on videos walking, he is usually assisted by a man, because he would put on leg braces that would essentially keep his legs straight. So he was able to maneuver and have the appearance of walking. Because of his polio, a lot of the times Eleanor Roosevelt, she would, I would say, take a more prominent first lady role. She will be one of the first, I will say, American first ladies that will take on this, what we know of being a first lady role, where you have the role, where you have programs and you show your face. Um, in 1932, when he is elected, he wins 57% of the popular vote, and he will introduce a flurry of new legislation within his first 100 days of office. And a lot of this legislation will be known as his New Deal legislation. So let's get into it. So the banking system at this time was on the verge of collapse. And so one of the first thing he passes within his first 100 days is the Emergency Banking Act, which is passed on March 9th, 1933. The Emergency Banking Act provided funds to shore up threatened banking institutions. Also in 1933, he'll pass the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act is pretty significant because what it did was bar commercial banks from becoming involved in the buying and selling of stocks. So what it essentially does is separate Main Street from Wall Street. Banks then are for the people, not for Wall Street, right? And so, what the Glass Steagall Act will do is prevent these banks from buying and selling stocks on the stock market. So, it separates Wall Street from Main Street. Also, under Glass Steagall, we get the FDIC. The FDIC stands for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The FDIC insures the accounts of individual depositors. This is significant because what it says is that if the bank fails and you have your money in that bank, you won't lose your money as a depositor. It essentially protects the people and it protects your money. We still have the FDIC. Usually banks will insure accounts up to a certain amount of money. I want to say about 250,000, maybe more. Don't quote me on that. These acts, the Glass-Steagall Act, the Emergency Banking Act, along with the FDIC, will help rescue the financial banking system. It's also at this time that FDR, in his first 100 days, will establish the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. Not that NRA, this NRA, the National Recovery Administration. So what the NRA, or the National Recovery Administration, was a government. What they would do was set codes for fair competition. So they would set standards for production. The NRA would also set prices for said goods, and they would also set a minimum wage in these production industries. So the purpose of the NRA, they wanted to raise prices, but also limit production, and also raise the minimum wage, raise the amount of money that people are making to work in these industries. It was the NRA would create government mandated codes for fair competition by setting standards for production and prices, as well as a minimum wage. Now, the next of these, again, I call this an alphabet soup because all of them have letters. So forgive the alphabet soup. Hopefully, you won't get confused by it. But if you do, just look to your notes and look to your textbook, okay? So we'll start with the Economy Act. The Economy Act reduced federal spending to win the confidence of the business community. Also established in the first 100 days was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This was established in May 1933. So, what they would do was make grants to local agencies that aided those who were impoverished by the Depression. So, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration would give grants to local agencies that helped people who had been impoverished by the Great Depression. Now, what was FDR's plan for the New Deal? One of his plans was to put people back to work. The Great Depression really destroyed the job market. People wanted to work, but there were no jobs. So, what the New Deal will do is create government jobs for people to have, right? And so, one of these government jobs will be the Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created in March 1933, and it employed young men to work on like preservation projects. So things like forest preservation, flood control, and the improvement of national parks and wildlife preserves. So the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, will employ millions of young men to work on conservation and like natural conservation projects such as forest prevention or preservation, flood control, and the improvement of national parks and wildlife preserves. By 1943, more than 3 million people will have passed through Civilian Conservation Corps camps. FDR will actually visit a civilian conservation corps camp, and one thing that he will say or make note of when his visit or when he goes to his visit is that a lot of these young men, the average young man, gained about 12 pounds um, going through the camp because they're able to be fed nutritious food. And so, at a time where people are literally starving, they're able to work on these public or work on these works projects, these conservation projects, and get fed and get paid for the work that they are doing. Okay, so we will stop here with the Civilian Conservation Corps and I will continue the alphabet soup and we'll actually really start in part 2. So I'll pick up with the Public Works Administration. See you soon.